Hello everyone, welcome to this Synth Ratings video. Today we are looking at Quad by Papen. This is a fairly new VST released in 2020, I think it was April, but it has been available as a rack extension for Reason for at least 5 years now. So it is not new as such, but it has been updated continuously during those years as a rack extension as well, and all of those features and updates are now included in the VST naturally. There are also AU and AAX versions available if that's your thing. The synth itself is a virtual analog at heart. It's a subtractive synth with waveforms and filters, but it has quite a few tricks up its sleeve in terms of phase distortion of these waveforms. The price of the plugin is $99 or 99 euros. Opening up the synth, we see this interface, and as you can see, it is divided into sections, with the most interesting feature probably being those 4 XY pads in the middle. Those XY pads are used to control the phase distortion and the wave shaper effects of the oscillator section. We'll get to that in a second, but first, just to get an idea of what the plugin sounds like, let's listen to a couple of presets. Here's the default one. Let's try a couple more. Alright, now that you have an idea of what it sounds like, let's explore the different sections. At the top you have the presets and bank controls, as well as the help button for opening up the manual, the ECS button for managing your MIDI mappings, and original and edit buttons to change between the original version of the sound, which is stored in the preset, and your edit. So if I make some edits here, then I can always do that. But I didn't like him, so I'm clicking the original button again. And I can switch between the read-only version, so to speak, and my edit version. Pretty handy. In the middle, as mentioned, you have the oscillator sections. There are 2 oscillators here to play around with. To the right, we have the 2 filters and the filter envelopes, the amp envelope and the volume controls, the play mode where you can change between arpeggiator, polyphonic, monophonic modes. You have the arpeggiator controls down here. You have the effects section, the modulation matrix, your wheels. Finally, the 2 modulation envelopes and the 2 LFOs down here. Let's initialize the preset and start playing around. This is what your basic sine wave default patch sounds like. Not very exciting. Let's change the waveform type to something else. We have 108 waveforms to choose from. And let's try to modify this one. You can change the tuning, octave, semitone, fine tuning, quite normal stuff. Double click to reset. You have this spread parameter, which is typical Papen. You can add a unison-like effect with this by spreading the pitch around. Even though you're still using just the one oscillator. You have a sub-oscillator here. You can add a sine wave to it, or a square wave. And control the volume of that in one dial. You have some analog style pitch drift, which you can't hear when I'm just playing one note. And of course the volume of each oscillator. You can, for oscillator 1, bypass the filter if you wish to do that. And you can, for both oscillators, enable or disable key track. And the free or fixed phase. Finally, you have the 2 main effects here for each oscillator, the phase distortion and the wave shaper. The phase distortion is where you select one of 22 different algorithms to control distortion in the waveform that you have selected. So let's say I try to fold it. In fact, let's change that to a sine wave. That makes it a lot easier to see what's going on. So I want to fold this waveform. First I increase the amount, nothing happens because my x and y parameters are still 0. I can change these by using these knobs here, or I can actually drag this blue dot around to modify the x and y parameters graphically directly like this. So quite a drastic effect on the waveform, as you can see. So let's try a couple more effects just to get a feel for it. As you imagine, you can get some pretty bizarre effects with this. And let's add the wave shaper on top of that. You have the same 22 algorithms here as well. Let's try some resonance. Bonk that up and of course, things get pretty interesting when you start modulating these parameters in real time. I'm backing this down to get a sound that we may be able to use for something later. Okay, not too bad, I'll keep that. Oscillator 2 has exactly the same controls with a couple of additions and actually one omission. You can't route the second oscillator to bypass the filter. Apart from that, it is the same as Oscillator 1, only better because you have a sync mode as well. You can choose hard sync or soft sync, which means that the pitch of Oscillator 2 is always synced to Oscillator 1, regardless of the settings you use for your tuning here. That means you change the timbre of the sound instead of its pitch. They're still in tune, but it kind of sounds more like you are playing with a resonant filter than changing the tuning controls. So that's cool. Some differences in the sound between the soft and hard sync modes, as you can hear. Let's not use spread for that one. Let's add a sub oscillator to oscillator 1 to beef it up a bit. Alright, you have the same controls for phase distortion and wave shaping here as well. So let's add some of that. I mean, that's what you get the synth for, right? Okay. Some nice overtones up there. We're getting some sort of gritty lead type sound here. Let's work with that. The final trick in the oscillator section is this little menu down here and the 2 dials below it. This is where you set up cross modulation, 16 different modes to choose from. You have ring modulation, frequency modulation, some feedback, and a lot of other interesting things to explore. And you just use these dials down here to control it. Ring modulation is controlled by amount and rectification, I suppose. While the other modes have their own labels for these controls. Pulse modulation uses feedback as its second control, while FM uses feedback as well, at least for this number 1 algorithm. There are several FM algorithms to choose from as well. And that's all there is to the oscillator section. Let's find out how it scores. So, rating the sound sources, we find that the main oscillators can really be twisted beyond all recognition with phase distortion and wave shaping, which is always a good thing. You have several good options for cross modulation between the oscillators as well, which is super interesting. And you have a decent variety of waveforms to begin with. Unfortunately, you only have 2 of those main oscillators, and the sub-oscillators, although they are there, are very basic and really can't be tweaked very much at all. And the final gripe I have here is that it is 2020 after all, and how about some user waves to import into the oscillator section? So overall, the sound sources get a decent rating of 6. Let's move on to the filter section, which has 2 filters, 1 and 2. You select them over here. You can change the routing from serial to parallel to OSC routing. And the final routing is that oscillator 1 goes to filter 1 and oscillator 2 goes to filter 2. And as mentioned before, you can simply bypass oscillator 1 from going into the filters at all. But we don't want to do that because we want to listen to the filters. That's our great starting sound, and I'm going to enable filter 1. We have lots of filter types to choose from here. There are 36 of them in total. And let's start with some basic low pass. Let's put the routing back to serial. You can change the frequency, the resonance, post filter volume, which is a shame because you can't actually try to overdrive the filters by doing some pre-filter volume here. You can set up modulation wheel to frequency cutoff. You can add key track to cutoff. You can pan the filters left or right. You can, of course, change the envelope amount, and the envelopes are down here, 1 for each filter. So if I change this, you can see that the second filter stays the same as it was. So let's just set up a simple little peak in the beginning of the sound. You notice that the envelopes have a fade parameter as well, which is something that happens to the level of the sustain when the sound is sustaining. I'll show you that later. And of course release. Let's try some different filter types. Right, there's a lot of filters to choose from. I want to point out some of the more special ones. You have a set of 6 special filters in kind of the middle of the menu here. Positive and negative comb filters. I mean, who doesn't like that? You have a vocal filter. And this vowel knob becomes active when you select it. There's a formant filter or 2. Pretty nice. And the ring filter. Which is pretty cool as well. You have 8 0 delay filters. They have a Z at the back of their names. These arrived in a recent update of the rack extension and are present here in the VST as well. And I think those filters, if you're going to use normal low pass, high pass, band pass, and notch filters, I think these filters do a better job of it than the original filters. So yeah, having 2 of those filters is pretty cool. You can, let's just add, okay, let's do a normal low pass here. And some crazy ring filter on the second one. can route them in serial or parallel. Let's pound them a little bit to the side. And it's quite a nice result overall. Finally, the oscillator routing as well can give some interesting results. So that's it for the filter section. Time to rate the filters, and on the positive side we can see that we have a good variety of filter types. No doubt about it, with 36 different ones to choose from. As I probably revealed earlier, I dig the comb filters, and some of the other special effects filters are nice as well. You have several different routing options, and overall you can get very good results out of the filter section. On the negative side, I think it's sometimes hard to tell different filter types in the same category apart. I mean, you have 9 different low-pass filters. I'm not sure I really need that many, and if there are that many, I should be able to tell them apart more easily than I can. The biggest miss, however, for me is the lack of a filter drive. I like to drive my filters, and the only way I can really do that here is by turning up the oscillator volumes, which can have some undesired effects and turn into some nasty digital clipping and so on. So a proper filter drive would be much preferable. In total, I find that the filters deserve a rating of 7. The next thing we're going to look at is the modulation section. The modulation section covers quite a few panels on the synth. Let's start by talking about the amp section over here, where you have the volume and velocity controls, the velocity shape as well for velocity curves, and the basic pan control. You have an amp envelope with attack, decay, sustain, fade, and release. I'm going to pause for a moment here and talk a little bit about the fade parameter, because it's something that you won't find in every envelope out there. What it does is affect the sustain stage. Here's a very simple sound with typical sustain. The fade only goes to the negative direction. If you look at the top of the screen where the parameter is displayed, you can see that it changes into different seconds and milliseconds. If I play the sound now, you can hear that it fades out almost instantly. As I increase this fade parameter, the length of the fade gets longer. And it can get super long. I'm not going to bother you with a 200-second fade here. Now the question is, why does the fade parameter go above 0? That just seems like a waste of good controller space to me. So yeah, it's slightly useful, but perhaps not as perfectly implemented as it could have been. Moving on, we have the modulation matrix over here. This is a 16-slot modulation matrix. It's a bit hard to scroll with this little scroll bar over here, but don't worry about that. You won't use 16 slots most of the time anyway. It's fairly standard. You can connect a source to a destination. You just pick a source from a menu, say random, destination, global pitch, all right, amount, and octave. Yeah, pitch is not perhaps what you would use random for, but why not? There are lots and lots of sources and destinations to choose from. You have 25 different sources and 173 destinations. Effects are included, so you can modulate the effects section as well, which is always good. Another great thing that is something I don't see every day is that you can click here to bypass a modulation source. Let's say I have this ridiculous random pitch going on. I can just bypass it. Nice. The modulation sources you are most likely to use are, of course, the envelopes and the LFOs, and you can set those up down here. It's the same envelope setup as everywhere else, except that you have a couple of new knobs here. You have the key to speed and the velocity to speed. So you can set the incoming pitch of the note to control the speed of your envelope, and the same thing with the velocity of the hit. You can sync the envelope to the tempo of your song, and that means that instead of milliseconds you have time measurements here. If you look at the top panel of the screen where it says free envelope 1 attack, up here it changes to, say, a quarter note when you have sync enabled and milliseconds when it is not enabled. So for rhythmic effects, that is nice to have. The controls for the two envelopes are identical, and they're called free envelopes in this modulation menu here. The LFOs are pretty basic. You have 6 different waveforms to choose from, sample and hold included, importantly, and you can set the mode, poly, free, or mono, and you can set the speed again in hertz or sync them to your time signature. You can of course control the phase distortion and wave shaper parameters with the modulation matrix as well, so let's do that. And you can see this little ghost ball pop out of nowhere to display the modulation for you. Which is cool, except that all the other controls do not have that kind of animation, so it could be nice to have some sort of display for other controls as well when they are being modulated. You can also use these X and Y controls as modulation sources, but they will always still be hardwired to the phase distortion or wave shaper controls. So let's say I use this X parameter here to control something else. I want to show you something else as well, and that is how you set up modulation in a quick way without going into the modulation matrix directly. Say I want to change my filter 1 frequency, I right click it and set modulation to pad 1x, this control up here, and set the amount. Then let's put this to serial. Then you have pad 1x controlling the filter, but it will also control the phase distortion X parameter. You can't remove that from the control. So the XY pads are great as modulation tools, but keep in mind that they will always perform their default functions as well. You cannot disconnect them from the phase distortion and wave shaper controls. One more thing I want to show you is that you can in fact modulate the effects parameters from here. Let's say you want to manipulate your reverb length. That's always good. So, and let's not use this. Let's use the modulation wheel for that. Okay, let's enable the reverb. I'll talk more about the effects later, of course. Lots of fun when you can modulate the effects, guys. Scoring the modulation options. First, we have 4 nice XY pads with built-in animated waveform displays, which are cool to look at and useful to control your sounds. Second, we have this neat little trick to bypass the individual mod matrix slots, which can help you speed up your sound design a little bit. That is always welcome. Third, we have the important ability to target effects parameters with modulation sources, and that always helps bring some extra movement to your sounds. There are some negatives, however, as well. Modulations can't modify buttons or menu settings like changing waveforms or filter types. There is no audio rate modulation here, which means you cannot set up, say, an oscillator to modulate your filter frequency, creating filter FM effects. And as I showed you, the fade parameter in the envelopes seems a little bit broken to me. Not saying that it's not useful at all, but perhaps it could be better implemented. Fourth and final point here, you can use the XY pads as modulation sources, but you cannot disconnect them from their original function as controllers for the phase distortion and wave shaper. As a whole, the modulation section is a little bit better than average, and it's a score of 6. Next stop is the effects panel. As you can see, there are 2 effects engines here, FX1, FX2. we just tried the reverb. Let's disable that and move on to FX1, which is the effect slot used for modulation effects. We have chorus, ensemble, flanger, phaser, and a widener. Let's try them out. I like the flanger, it's pretty good. The chorus and ensemble, I'm not too sure about. The phaser. There aren't any algorithms to choose from within each effects type, but there are plenty of parameters to play around with, so you can have some fun with that. I would just want to say that the widener is not my particular favorite here. I don't really hear any stereo widening going on. It sounds more like an auto panner, which can be cool, but it's not exactly what I think of when I hear the word widener. Let's move on to the second effects engine, which is the reverb and delay engine. It used to be that you could only choose one of those at a time, but this little box has been added in an update somewhere along the road, and you can now use delay into reverb or reverb into delay. So that's good. To control the different effects, you have to switch between them here in this menu. So now that I'm using both delay and reverb, I have to switch between the two effects here to control the parameters of the different effects, which is a bit confusing, but I understand why they did it that way. They could just bolt this little box on without having to change the interface in any other way. So it makes sense, I suppose, even though it's a little bit confusing. Let's try one of them at a time. Standard controls here with different delay times for left and right channels, feedback, cross feedback, low pass and high pass filters, and a modulation. And equal feed. Not too bad. And the reverb. The original quad rack extension was released with the old reverb algorithm that Rob Papen and his team had made, and it didn't really sound very good. But at some point down the road, they developed a new reverb algorithm, which is a lot better. And I'm happy to say that that was included both in the rack extension of Quad in later versions and in this VST version. So what you have here is the good reverb algorithm, which I happen to like. That's not bad at all. That's about it for what you can do with the effects engines. Let's try to score them. A major plus point, as mentioned, is that new updated reverb algorithm found in newer Papen plugins, which is included here and really does the business. I also think the phaser and flanger effects are decent, if not spectacular. However, there are a couple of negatives that kind of mar this effects section. I think most of the modulation effects are not that great, and the widener just sounds like kind of a weird auto pan. There is a fixed routing. You cannot reorder the effects or apply them to select oscillators or filters only. So you can't say send one filter to the reverb and another filter to a chorus. That's not possible. You have to put everything on everything. There is also no choice of algorithms per effect type, which kind of limits the usability of the effects. And finally, there is no equalizer, which would also have been great to have. Overall, I find the effects section to be pretty average, and that is reflected with a score of 5. It's time to talk a little bit about the ease of use. Whenever I click a control, you can see that I get this menu where you can set it to default, 0, minimum, maximum, mid, set to a numeric value, or set it to random, which is also cool. What is not cool is that there is no randomizer feature for the entire synth, which would be super useful for such an experimental device like this. You can set up modulation by right-clicking any control that you want to modulate and moving down to set modulation to, And there's this huge menu here which isn't nested, which is a little bit strange because it is nested in the modulation matrix. Let's use the LFO, and this new modulation routing instantly appears. If I try to change them down there, you can see that the menus are nested in a much nicer way. For example, for the destinations, you have all the effects, the filters, the oscillators, and so on. Much easier to deal with than this strange menu up here. So that's a bit of a miss, although it's nice to have the ability to set modulations by right-clicking. There's a help button, which brings up the manual. If you click it, the manual is 53 pages long. It describes all the different wave shaping and phase distortion effects with graphics and everything. So it's really something to sit down and enjoy if you like that sort of thing. There are also a couple of sections which have preset handling, like the modulation matrix. I can save this modulation setup as a preset and load it another time. And the same thing goes for the arpeggiator, which isn't really that interesting because there's not so much you can edit down here. You can set on and off for the different steps, and you can set velocity, which by the way is a pain because when I reach the bottom of the screen, it stops. So a bit annoying. You can rectify this by moving to the left or right, by the way. My mouse pointer is at the bottom, move to the left to set it to 0. So that kind of works. So yeah, you can also set up MIDI learn in here. Latch to MIDI, move something on your controller, like this modulation wheel. And now I have latched it to MIDI controller 1. Unlatch. Now it doesn't do that anymore. You can also save these MIDI mappings with this ECS menu, load and save ECS or clear MIDI. So that's about it for the ease of use category. It's time to put a score down for this category, and on the plus side we have obviously huge improvement over the rack extension interface in this VST. Rack extension interfaces do have their limits, and Rob Papen and his team have broken out of those limitations and created something better for the VST, so that's always good to see. As I've already mentioned, the manual is good. You have these handy right-click shortcuts all over the place, and you can use modulation matrix presets, which is a super nice thing to have. You also have presets for the arpeggiator, but that's not as useful. As I've shown you, setting arp velocity can be a little bit of a pain, and it's actually easier in the rack extension. Another thing that I showed you is that although you can assign modulation by right-clicking a knob, the menus feel kind of messy and are not nested in the same way as they are in the mod matrix. So that's something you have to get your head around as well. It is good news that delay and reverb can now be used together in Effects Engine 2, but this feature was obviously late to the party and kind of bolted on and doesn't work perfectly in terms of interface. But that's a minor niggle. All things considered, I find Quad to be a pretty easy synth to use with a pleasant interface, and this is reflected with a good rating of 7. The next thing on the list is to talk a little bit about the included presets of this synth, and any Rob Papen synth usually comes with a boatload of presets, and this one does as well with almost 1050 of them. Let's listen to a few more presets. Rob Papen is famous for making synths with lots and lots of presets, and I guess it makes sense that he has developed a bank manager system which is present in many of his newer synths, including this one. So what you do is click this manager button up here, and you can see all the factory presets available to you. you start on the right hand side by selecting a bank. The presets are organized into banks based on genre, like trance or ambient, or by sound designer. You can move around and audition presets by using the computer keyboard, which I always love. And you can star mark the ones that you fancy and make them easier to find for later. You can also select multiple presets, save them, load them, copy, paste, etc. So this bank manager has all the functionality you need to keep those presets under control and ready to use. Scoring the presets, we know that any Rob Papen synth will come with a big bunch of presets, and this is no exception. There are over 1,000 of them here, and that works out to less than 10 cents per preset if you look at it that way. Most of the presets have interesting modulations already set up, so you can control different aspects of the sound with your keyboard controls. And the bank manager is very helpful for organizing your sounds. One unfortunate thing that often happens when plugins have a long life cycle is that many presets will become old and won't utilize the newer features of the synth, and that is the case here as well. Many presets are ported over from the earlier RE versions of the plugin and obviously won't use the newer waveforms or features. As far as I can tell, there are no third-party sound banks available yet for the VST version. There are a few banks out there for the rack extension, but Reason uses its own refill format, and that can't be used in the VST unless the developer converts them or someone makes a conversion tool. These are rather minor criticisms, however, and the rating for the presets category is a 7. The final few sections of the synth that we haven't touched upon yet are the play mode and the arpeggiator sections. The play mode allows you to select between polyphonic, mono, legato, and arp mode, and the same modes with unison enabled. So total of 8 modes here. Let's try the unison out first. I don't think I want to play with my stupid sound anymore, so let's just go back to an init sound. Alright, here's a saw, I'll use that. Let's enable unison on it. You have amount controls and spread controls, which are normal. You can have up to 6 voices of unison. One more thing I want to show you with the unison is that you can set this delay parameter as well. And what it does is spread out the different unison hits in time. You also have these octave modes. And if nothing else, this delay parameter helps you to understand what the unison is actually doing. In this case, it is adding 2 notes, 1 octave and 2 octaves above the original sound. Play them together, you get this. Could be potentially used for strumming effects for guitar or stuff like that. You also have a spread mode. With 2 and 3 octaves as well. If you want to change this into an arpeggiated sound, you have to click it into Uni Arp. That will enable the arpeggiator, which can have a maximum of 16 steps. You can control the speed. You can control the number of octaves up to 4. And the mode, you have a couple of modes to choose from here. The normal up, down, down, up, random mode. You have ordered, reverse ordered, ordered up and down, ordered down, up. And you also have a chord mode, which if you play a chord will do just that. Which is interesting. You can add swing, you can control the gate length, and you can set the velocity amount here. You can latch it, so you don't have to keep the keyboard pressed, and you can sync it to the host, or you can leave it unsynced. So that's it for the arpeggiator. It's pretty basic, but it does get a job done. You have a mono and legato mode. You can enable the portamento, a couple of different varieties of portamento as well, and set the amount. And you can combine it with unison. You can clearly hear the difference between mono and legato here. In legato mode, the note doesn't re-trigger. The final feature I want to mention is that you can use custom tunings. You do this by clicking the Quad logo and going into the back panel, so to speak, of the synth. This is where you set the screen size, the master tune, and the tuning scale. And you have a couple of included tunings to choose from, like Chinese, Persian, and so on. That's not a normal Western scale by any means. That's about it for the features. Scoring the features. On the plus side, we have good unison with an interesting delay parameter. There is support for exotic tunings, and several of them are included. The negatives here are that the arpeggiator is pretty basic, and as I mentioned earlier in the video, I would really love to see some sort of patch randomizer that would suit this synth perfectly. As for features, there's not a lot else to mention, and the rating for this category is an average 5. The time has come to talk about the CPU efficiency of Quad. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you will know how this works. I do different kinds of sounds and play a sequence of single notes, and I watch the CPU meter as the sequence goes along, recording the result of the maximum CPU usage. Remember that this is done on my personal workstation, which may be very different from yours, but it still gives a good relative score compared to other VSTs run on the same machine. So for a simple patch, just a simple oscillator, not a lot of modulation, no effects, no unison, a sequence with single notes uses 0.22% of my CPU, which is excellent. Adding both effects engines to that gives us a number of 0.53%, which is still good. Moving on to a more complex patch with both oscillators and sub-oscillators in action, all kinds of modulations going on, both filters used and so on, but still no unison. The scores are 0.54% for the complex patch without effects and 0.77% with effects, both of which are good. The real test usually happens when we add unison to this. For Quad, the numbers with unison increase to 2.26 and 2.57% with effects added, which is an average score. But remember that some synths totally fall apart when you add unison here. The final test is to take a selection of factory presets and play the same sequence with them and average out the results. And the CPU usage for Quad when doing this is 0.68%, which is also good. One thing that is not great here is that the memory usage per instance of Quad is 127 megabytes, which is rather large. Many plugins only require a couple of megabytes or maybe 10 to 20 megabytes, so going over 100 means the score will be deducted a little bit because of that. Final score in this category is a 6. My opinion on the overall results you can get with Quad is that there is an experimental air about this plugin. It is kind of hard to predict what will happen when you mess around with the central XY pads in particular. This can make for a slower workflow sometimes, but sometimes you hit real gold that perhaps you wouldn't find with other more standard synths. And I guess that's part of the point. The preset library is in the same vein. There are many unusual patches tending towards the darker, harder sounds, perhaps most useful for harder EDM or gritty sci-fi, horror, dark, ambient kind of tracks. One thing I want to point out is that we all know the loudness war when it comes to music, but is there such a thing for synths as well? Probably, because louder is always perceived as better. And Quad is rather quiet, as are in fact most rack extensions when compared to their VST counterparts. I suspect that maybe the developer forgot to account for this here, and I recommend using your favorite gain plugin after the synth to add roughly 6 decibels of gain to bring it back into the game. I think you will notice a difference. Overall, it is a capable synth, though probably one to add to an existing arsenal for some extra spice, if you will, and perhaps not the first one to buy if you're just starting out with your music production. The rating in this category is a 6. When it comes to value for money, we have a medium-priced plugin here at $99 or euros. Rob Papen has an Explorer bundle available, which gives you all 26 of their plugins at a price of $499 or euros. There are excellent stepped complete your bundle deals available if you already own 1, 2, 3 or 4 Papen plugins. You could, for example, use this by buying Quad and get the bundle for $299 more, saving you $100 from just buying the bundle outright. There is a 1-month demo available. In this category, we also have to mention that Rob Papen has an excellent record when it comes to cross-grade offers, updating plugins and adding presets. On its own, I think the plugin has a rating of 6. However, with the bundle options available and the continued support of the company, I will increase the score to 7. Here we have the diagram showing all the scores for every category, and we can see that the synth is pretty well rounded. It has a couple of bumps, as you can see, and those are the effects and the features categories pulling the score a little bit down, while the presets, ease of use, filters, and value for money are all pretty strong points for this synth. Putting it all together, the final rating for Quad is 6.2, which gives a recommendation of decent. Thanks for sticking with me through this video. Here are some closing comments. I find this synth is probably best at the experimental sound effects and sequences, and perhaps the harder, darker sounds. The one thing I might want to highlight for its less desirable qualities is that it seems to struggle a little bit with deep bass, but this is also a problem with many other digital synths. Its unpredictability can be a bad thing as well, but come on, nobody's buying this for its electric pianos anyway. A final word is that perhaps the synth was more exciting when it came out in RE format 5-6 years ago than it is today. It still is a capable synth with its unique selling points, but the expectations in the market have been raised significantly in that time. That's all, folks. Thanks for watching, and see you later.